They called it the Endless War. For nearly 300 galactic cycles, it had raged like a wildfire across star systems. Alliances rose and crumbled, fleets burned in the void, and entire planets became nothing more than slag and memory. The Scific Dominion had launched the first assault, a blitzkrieg through the Tarlan cluster, expecting a swift and total domination of the core worlds. But the unified galactic concord had pushed back, hard. What followed was a grinding, pitiless war of attrition, slow, senseless, and seemingly without end, until the humans arrived. But this isn't the part where they show up with gleaming and speeches about peace. No. This is the part before that, when the galaxy still thought. Earth was a backwater blue rock, with a violent history and primitive tendencies. My name is Vorekdal, former commander of the Zyrene Naval Intelligence Corps, and I was there stationed in orbit, over Kaltoris Prime, when the humans arrived. I remember what it felt like to think we had control. I remember the arrogance, the certainty, and I remember the silence that followed. It all started with a signal, a narrow-band encrypted burst that bypassed our entire security grid like it wasn't even there. It didn't scream invasion or diplomatic contact. It just hummed. Unregistered frequency on Vector 37 Alpha, my comms officer had reported. Encoding unknown. Origin, Sol system. Sol, that insignificant star orbited by Earth, a Class 3 world. Sentience, just a few centuries past combustion engines. Nothing in our databases indicated they even had FTL capability. But the signal didn't lie. Send a probe, I ordered. The probe launched, it never came back. The second signal was louder, sharper, like a blade drawn across the mind. It disrupted 2 of our listening satellites and caused temporary blindness in every organic on Deck 9. That's when we realized it wasn't just a message, it was a demonstration. I requested emergency counsel with Fleet Admiral Korsha. She was the kind who never flinched, not even when a Scific dreadnought bore down on us in orbit over Drin 7. She flinched when I played her the signal. It's not just code, she said. There's structure, rhythm. This is military, tactical. Whoever sent this, they're not asking to talk. They're announcing they're already in play. I didn't want to believe it. Who could? Earth had no history of galactic engagement. Their species wasn't even registered as fully integrated in Concord affairs. But their signal spoke in a language only warriors understood. It said, "We've been watching. We've seen enough. You had your chance." 2 hours later, Kaltoris Prime was under attack. But not by humans. No, the Scific had launched their largest offensive in 50 cycles, 5 dread groups, each flanked by fighter clouds and anti-grav drop pods. And they weren't heading for our military installations. They were heading for the civilian arcologies. I still remember the burning skies, the people running through the corridors. I was trying to coordinate an evacuation from the orbital station, but the comm grid had fractured. Fleet Command was overwhelmed. We were losing. We knew it. The Scific knew it. And somewhere out there, Earth was watching. That's when the lights went out. Every starship in orbit dimmed like a candle snuffed in vacuum. One moment we were panicking. The next, everything was still. A new signal cut across all frequencies, overriding Scific and Concord, transmissions alike. It was forwards.com, and without flair. Humanity has entered theater. No one knew what to make of it. Then the stars moved. They weren't ships, not like ours. These things were matte black, non-reflective, and completely silent. They didn't register on our radar. They didn't emit energy signatures. But when they fired, we knew. The lead Scific dreadnought, the same vessel that had decimated 5 Concord worlds, disappeared in an instant. No explosion, just a hole, punched through space, where it had been. One blink and it was gone. The rest of the Scific fleet didn't wait to understand. They opened fire in every direction. Space lit up with plasma arcs and beam trails. The human ships didn't dodge. They didn't shield. They moved like thought surgically, instantly. In 17 minutes, the Sarek offensive was over. Not because they retreated, because there was nothing left to retreat with. It took hours for the shock to settle. On my ship, no one spoke, no one moved. I stared at the tactical display and watched as human vessels simply hovered. No demands, no flags, no parley, just presence. Then a final transmission came through. Conflict evaluated, stability enforced, human forces disengaging, and just like that, they were gone. Vanished into subspace corridors we couldn't even detect. We ran every scan, every frequency check, every probe trajectory. Nothing. It was like trying to find a whisper in a storm. Later that week, the unified Galactic Concord met in emergency session. Ambassadors screamed for context. The Sarek were in hiding. The Arlax accused humanity of deploying forbidden tech. The Vrish tried to open a case under Article 9, unauthorized, militarized intervention. But it didn't matter, because the war was over. Not in months, not in days, in hours, and no one wanted to risk it starting again. We didn't contact Earth, we didn't dare. I resigned from my post that cycle. You don't understand what it feels like to be the apex predator your whole life, then watch something you didn't even consider sentient end a centuries-long war in under a standard rotation. But the humans did. They didn't negotiate peace. They enforced it. And they didn't stay to gloat. They never do. That's what scares me most, because somewhere out there, they're still watching. The war had raged for decades. The Kelron ascendancy, with its insectoid warriors and hive mind strategists, had broken empire after empire like snapping twigs. The Lorati, once proud and technologically superior, now clung to a handful of burning planets. Their last bastion, a fleet of scarred ships, orbited, a gas giant that pulsed red with radiation, inside the war room of the Zereth Prime. The flagship of the Lorati remnant, General Varelkas, stood staring at a dying star chart. Every red flash on the map meant a lost system, and there were a lot of red flashes. They'll breach our perimeter within 12 hours, said Fleet Analyst Jorwin. Kelron fleets are advancing in a trident formation, flanked by subspace mines and bioplasma swarms. We've exhausted every strategy, Varelkas replied, his voice brittle. There's nothing left but surrender or extinction. It was then the transmission came, a simple, grainy hologram. A human young, in a plain black uniform. No medals, no pomp. General Varelkas. This is Lieutenant Avery Tran, speaking on behalf of Earth's Unified Planetary Defense Command. We're here to help. Send us coordinates. We'll take it from here. The Lorati didn't know what stunned them more, that a single planet was offering to help after entire star nations had fallen, or the absurd confidence in the humans' voice. We have nothing to lose, Jorwin muttered, and perhaps they don't either. Within 6 hours, the humans arrived. At first, they seemed underwhelming. A single strike carrier, flanked by a pair of smaller craft, no massive dreadnoughts, no psychic commanders, no fleets of living ships, just cold metal hulls painted matte black, moving like silent wolves through the dark. The humans called it the Apollyon Protocol. It started with silence, no hails, no lights, and then the noise. Kel ran comes across the sector crackled, then went dark. The first Kelron cruiser, an obsidian black beetle of a ship, simply imploded. Not exploded, imploded, as if reality had lost interest in supporting its existence. No weapon, signature, no visible projectile, just the absence of mass where there had once been death. They used targeted gravitic folding, Jorwin gasped, watching the feed. That tech hasn't been stabilized in 1,000 years. The humans didn't respond. They didn't need to. They moved like Reaper's sleek black ships that dodged plasma storms with centimeter precision. Where they passed, Calron formations died, not retreated. Died. It wasn't even close. The Calron, unaccustomed to fear, began transmitting warnings to their own kind. Signals scrambled by human AI countermeasures. Rewritten into loops of ancient Earth War songs. Distorted into terrifying crescendos. The final wave of Calron ships tried to mass and overwhelm the humans near the moon of Eltharus Prime. They never made it. The Lorati saw it first. From their command deck, a sensor officer whispered, "What is that?" A red shimmer rippled across space, a blooming, silent pulse that swept through the enemy like a scythe. The humans had deployed a temporal dissonance field. The Calron ships halted, stuttered, froze. Then, one by one, aged 1,000 years and seconds, hulls corroded. Engines turned to rust. Entire bioforms inside screamed into dust as time devoured them. 3 hours after the first human strike, silence returned to space. No more red dots, no Calron signatures, no threats. Virelcast stood before the holographic feed as Lieutenant Tran reappeared. "It's done," she said simply. The general's mandibles twitched. "You eliminated an enemy that had conquered half the galaxy in less time than it takes us to run a combat simulation." Tran offered a half smile. That's what happens when humans finally show up to the fight. The galaxy had always viewed Earth as a developing world. Wild, unstable, full of self-destructive tendencies. But now they saw it for what it truly was. A sleeping apex predator. The humans didn't fight for conquest, or glory, or even revenge. They fought because someone threatened their allies, and that was enough. One Lorati historian would later write, "The war ended not with a treaty or a surrender, but with a warning carried on the ruins of the Calron fleet. Do not awaken Earth, unless you're ready for the consequences." They had no idea what they were walking into. The War Council of the Gorkari Alliance met in their obsidian-floored chamber. Great plumes of methane-rich vapor wafting from the nostrils of the gathered warlords. One by one, they took their place. Along the curve of the War Tabola, long obsidian arc carved from a meteor that had destroyed a rebel moon. Tradition, power, dominance. These things mattered to the Gorka Ri. High Warlord Skravtun slammed a data slab onto the table. The humans have entered the Zyran front. 5 fleets. Heavy capital ships. They burned through Sector 39 in less than an hour. One of the older warlords scoffed. Sector 39 was already weak. Spread too thin. Let's not overstate this species. They vaporized an orbital fortress while their marines were already inside it. Skravtun growled. They knew it was a trap and walked in anyway, then blew it from the inside. That silenced the room. The Gorkari had fought hundreds of wars. They respected strength, and the humans were not subtle. They weren't delicate. They weren't diplomatic. They were brutal. Reports had filtered in from dozens of fronts. Human infantry, even when outnumbered, were holding choke points like mythic beasts. Urban battles that would have taken weeks were resolved in hours. Their coordination was unnatural, not because they communicated faster, but because they didn't need to. "They're guessing what their comrades will do," said one analyst. "Predictive behavior. It's instinctive. It's animal." It wasn't animal. It was human, on the ground. The war told a clearer story. Lieutenant Sarah Vance wiped gore from her visor and leaned over the smoking crater of what used to be a fortified Zyran command post. Her platoon was exhausted, but upright. 47 humans, 200 dead Zyrans. Most of them didn't even get off a shot. Her comm clicked. "Lieutenant, this is command. Eyes up. You've got 6 bird forms at high altitude. Possible counterstrike." She looked up. The sky above was a bruised purple, scarred with smoke trails and the bright streaks of active railgun fire. At altitude, the enemy strike flyers darted into position. Her squad had no anti-air left, and yet she didn't flinch. "Roger that," she replied. "We'll improvise." Vance lifted her arm. One of her engineers handed her a magnetic mine. She pointed to the ruin of a Zyran artillery drone, buried under rubble, but still sparking with life. "Think we can overclock that engine?" The engineer laughed. "I can make it fly." 10 minutes later, the rigged-up corpse of an alien war machine launched skyward with a howling, unstable whine. As the enemy fighters swept low, the hacked artillery drone exploded midair, its EMP charge frying the guidance systems of the attackers. 4 of them nose-dived. The remaining 2 were taken out by rifle fire as they limped through the clouds. The battlefield was quiet again, in orbit. The humans were even worse. They broke formation. They ignored protocols. And yet somehow, they won. A Gorkari battleship Rax class, with 12 heavy cannons and layered shielding, went up in a bloom of plasma when a human cruiser rammed it at full burn. Not a tactic, a choice. A captain's decision, made in the heat of the moment. The humans recovered the survivors. None of them were angry. They were proud. "Honor is in the result," they said, and their allies began to believe it. On the alien world of Tesca Prime, a delegation of non-aligned races watched as human squads rescued entire underground cities, navigating networks without maps, using only instinct and sound. No trophies. No looting. Just the mission. That was new. The Shazari diplomat, tall and insectoid, whispered to her aide. "They do not conquer. They burn through obstacles. Like fire, yes, but not to consume. To clear the path. Hours, not days." That was the phrase that kept spreading across comms. "We planned this battle for 3 months. It took them 6 hours. We deployed 10,000 troops. They sent 400 everywhere. They fought." The pattern repeated. Humans didn't just win battles. They warped the expectations of war itself. Strategy became reaction. Diplomacy became silence. And fear. That was no longer something the enemy deployed, it was what they felt. Back on Earth, the news feeds struggled to keep up. Journalists embedded on the front lines were overwhelmed by footage. Armored humans hauling civilians from collapsed cities. A medic unit operating under sniper fire, without flinching. An orbital skirmish resolved with a single, precisely timed nuke. None of it seemed possible, and yet, it happened. Not because humans had better tech. They didn't. Not because they were faster, stronger, smarter. It was because they were more willing to sacrifice, to adapt, to end things. On the Zaran homeworld, panic broke through the crust of arrogance. The High Chancellor convened an emergency tribunal. Their defenses were still vast, their armies massive, but humans didn't stop. The Chancellor gripped the edges of his throne, claws trembling. "How long until they arrive?" The general bowed his head. "Hours, sir. Not days, not weeks, just hours. And then it would be over." The battlefield smelled like metal and fire, as if the very atmosphere had been turned into slag. Captain Jarrell of the Zeltraxian Republic stood on the ridge overlooking the devastation. His forearms folded behind his back, mandibles twitching. With the mix of shock and dread he no longer had the luxury to hide. Below him, where the Zarn Dominion once held an ironclad front, there was now only silence and human silhouettes moving through the smoke. "Scan again," Jarrell barked to his communications officer, a young Tegron whose scales pulsed nervously. "Already. Did. Twice. Captain, there's no enemy left. Just vapor and craters. And those humans, cleaning up like it's maintenance day." Jarrell clenched his mandibles tighter. 3 hours ago, this was a fully entrenched enemy position, with 200,000 Zarn warriors. How? The question hung in the air like a guillotine. No one answered, because they all knew the same thing. Humanity. They weren't a war species. Not like the Zarn, who were bred in vats of acid and raised on pain. Not like the Zeltraxians, who honed warfare as a noble craft. Humans weren't bred for battle. They were born in comfort, raised on distractions, and yet, they ended wars, like erasers, on CHALKBOARDS. Below the ridge, a squad of humans was moving across the field, completely relaxed. Their armor was dirty, dented in places, but they walked like it meant nothing, casual, confident. Their leader, a woman with a shaved head and a cigar dangling from her mouth, pointed at a pile of twisted Zarn remains and said something. The squad laughed. They laughed. Jor-El turned to his second-in-command. "How many humans did we deploy here?" "One company. 150, maybe 160. "And how many of them remain?" The Tegron officer checked the datapad. "All of them. No casualties reported." Jor-El didn't respond. What could he say? 3 hours? An entire front line obliterated. The Zarn had held that ground for a year. Generals had called it the Wall. Thousands had died trying to breach it. Artillery, orbital strikes, even bioweapons had failed to make a dent. But the humans, they'd walked in. And now the Wall was a memory. Jor-El watched the woman with the cigar kneel by a dying Zarn commander. She didn't shoot. She didn't taunt. She just said something, quietly, then stood up and walked away, leaving the beast to die alone. There was no joy in their victory, just efficiency. That terrified him more than anything. In the makeshift command tent behind the ridge, the Joint Council gathered in stunned silence. Zeltraxians, Tegrons, Olmari. Even a hesitant Drozi ambassador watched the footage replayed on a hovering screen. The humans had breached the Wall at 5 distinct points simultaneously. They'd used minimal explosives, no orbital support, and most seemingly no hesitation. The footage showed them moving like ghosts, fast, precise. Every shot a kill, every movement part of some terrible ballet, choreographed by experience and rage. They efficient. The Olmari general muttered, her gossamer wings drooping. The Drozi ambassador hissed, "This is beyond efficiency. This is extermination." General Rika Tanners, commander of Earth's coalition force, leaned back in her chair, chewing that same damn cigar. "We warned you. You invited us into this war. Don't act shocked now that we know how to win it. You said you had advisors." Jor-El growled, "You didn't say you'd deploy ... executioners." Tanners shrugged. "We were advisors. Until yesterday. But when the Zarn bombed civilian refugee shelters on Viridian 3, we decided enough was enough, and so you wiped them out." Tanner stood slowly. The tent fell silent as her boots clacked against the floor. "You've all spent decades fighting this war like it was a game of politics. You feared casualties more than failure. You debated tactics while children bled in shelters. My people." She took the cigar out and pointed it like a weapon. "We don't play games. Not when survival's on the line. You asked us to fight. We fought. You're welcome." "You're monsters," the Drozi hissed. Tanners leaned in, staring the ambassador dead. In his eye cluster, "No, we're humans. And if that scares you, then maybe you're the problem." Outside, the smoke had begun to clear. Engineers were already working to demine the fields, and the first supply transports buzzed overhead. Human medics were tending to injured Zeltraxian troops without hesitation or question. Their discipline was chilling. No time wasted. No mercy lost. Private Reyes crouched beside a broken drone, inspecting its core. "Hey," his squadmate Stevens called. "You ever wonder why they keep calling us Deathworlders, like it's a curse?" Reyes smirked, brushing dirt off the glowing power core. "'Cause it is for them." Another soldier, Thompson, laughed. "You see that one Zarn that tried to charge us with a plasma lance? Dude didn't even make it 5 steps before Martha shot him through both eyes." Stevens shook his head. "I don't get it. They fight like we're demons." Reyes looked out across the wasteland. "That's 'cause we are. To them, we grew up in a world that tried to kill us every day. Starvation, war, disease, predators, each other. Earth forged us. We don't scare easy. Stevens pointed toward the ridge. They're scared now. Good. Rhea stood. Fear makes people listen. In orbit, the Zarn High Commander watched the feeds from a shattered satellite. He saw the humans. He saw the fire. He saw the end. And for the first time in his species' history, the Zarn war leader activated the emergency withdrawal beacon not for strategic retreat, but for full surrender. The humans didn't have superior numbers. They didn't have better tech. What they had was something far more dangerous. Resolve. They didn't fear pain. They measured it. They didn't fear death. They mastered it. The war had lasted 60 years, across 5 sectors. 9 empires had fallen, but when humans joined, it ended in hours. Because where others fought to, when humans fought like they, already lost once, and they weren't letting it happen again. And when they brought their fire and fury, the galaxy finally understood what it meant when Earth said, "We're coming." They didn't celebrate immediately. The silence after the last shot was heavier than any explosion. Across the battlefield, on the planets, in the wrecked orbitals, and inside the command vessels, every species waited for confirmation, waited to understand what had just happened, because nothing made sense. The hegemony's war machine, something that had devoured solar systems whole, folded like paper within hours of humanity's deployment. Whole fleets had turned to slag. Entire divisions of shock troops vanished beneath coordinated orbital strikes. Strongholds withstood for decades fell in minutes. But what shook the galaxy wasn't the speed of victory, was the ease, the precision, the cruelty wrapped in mercy. The fact that humans hadn't broken a sweat, and now they stood, quiet, still, in the smoke. General Trevin of the Thari watched the replay on his holoscreen for the 5th time. He still couldn't breathe right. He wasn't alone across the galaxy. Every military commander from the allied species was reviewing the footage with a quiet dread, and the question echoed like a whisper they were afraid to ask. What are the humans? Trevin turned toward the human commander. Colonel Adrian Bale, who stood nearby sipping rehydrated coffee like she was waiting for a bus. He finally asked, "Why didn't you send more units? You only sent 4 battalions?" She looked at him over the rim of the metal cup. "Why send more when we hadn't lost anyone yet? You crushed them." "They needed crushing," she replied without remorse. "They started this. We finished it." Trevin opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, because what could he say? She wasn't boasting. It was simply a statement of fact. Across the communication feeds, other commanders were whispering the same thing. There were already movements in the Galactic Council species debating whether humans were too dangerous, whether the war had simply traded one threat for another, and whether allying with Earth had been a mistake. But for the first time in centuries, there was peace. The last holdout of the hegemony had surrendered. Or rather, they'd begged. After watching a single human unit tear through their orbital shields using outdated kinetic artillery repurposed from mining drills, they'd opened every frequency and pleaded for terms. The humans gave them silence. Then, after 6 minutes, they transmitted a simple message: cease aggression, disarm, or repeat the lesson. And just like that, it ended. Not with a treaty, not with confetti, but with the stunned realization that it was over. The humans returned to their ships, quiet, efficient. No victory parades, no posturing. They refused even the official medals. The Galactic Council tried to pin on them. When asked why, one human marine simply replied, "We didn't do it for glory. We did it because you asked for help." Weeks passed. The galaxy tried to return to normal. But normal had shifted. Human ships began patrolling the former war zones, not as conquerors, but as observers. Their presence was enough to keep systems from slipping back into chaos. Piracy dropped by 93% in some regions, simply because of the rumor that a human destroyer might be nearby. Aid poured in from Earth. Reconstruction efforts led by human engineers restored what took alien bureaucracies decades to delay. They moved with the speed and clarity of a species that had clawed its way through its own apocalypse once before, and yet unease remained. Inside the council chamber, debates grew heated. Some species feared the humans, others revered them. A few wanted to limit Earth's influence before it spread further. Trevin sat in one of those meetings, listening to the endless arguments. He had aged during the war, lost friends, blood, and hope, but nothing haunted him more than how calm the humans had been. There had been no bloodlust, just deadly resolve. "They're too dangerous," said one member, his scales bristling. "We replaced a tyrant with a god." "They never asked for power," Trevin replied. "They responded to a distress call. We didn't vet their tactics, because we didn't have the luxury. They saved us. They could have done worse." "They could have," Trevin admitted, "but they didn't." A voice echoed from the chamber's edge. It was Vale. She stood beside the door, having arrived early for the next session. No expression on her face, just eyes like iron. She spoke without being asked. "We didn't come to rule. We came to end a threat. You called. We answered." The room fell silent. She continued, "If you're scared of us, fine. You should be. Not because we'll conquer you, but because when we commit to something, we finish it. And that includes peace." A few delegates tried to push back, to draw lines, to discuss limits on human involvement, but the war was still too fresh. The memory too sharp, back on Earth. The reaction was equally strange. There were no mass celebrations. The news channels covered the victory, but there was no gloating. Veterans of Earth's long and brutal history knew better. Humanity had evolved under pressure, violence, and desperation, and they saw what others didn't. The war hadn't been a test of strength. It had been a mirror, a reflection of what they had become. They hadn't just fought harder. They had fought smarter, coldly, calmly. They had used everything: physics, psychology, terrain, even the enemy's ego. There were reports of human units intentionally faking retreats to expose weak points. Others had broadcast ancient Earth songs, mid-battle, tunes that scrambled enemy morale. They weren't just soldiers. They were predators, but ones who knew what it meant to survive. Helland, who wouldn't let others go through it alone. Colonel Vale returned to Earth 6 weeks after the war's end. She declined all interviews. Instead, she visited a single graven marked on a windy hill overlooking the Atlantic. She stood there for hours. No one knew whose it was. When asked later by a friend, she simply said, "The one who taught me what a promise meant." Back in orbit, Earth's flagship remained silent. Its name was carved into the hull in 6 languages, including the native script of the now-defeated hegemony. It read, "We came because you called." And underneath that, scratched by hand into the metal, "When humans arrive, the war ends." Because it wasn't just over, it never stood a chance.